Hello everyone, and welcome to my honor season presentation, Pixels on Perdition, a study of toxicity in the game Overwatch. This was a passion project born out of my competing frustration and admiration for the games industry. In this project, we'll be taking a look at the historical and current presence of game player toxicity in the games industry and how it applies to one of the most popular games of the decade, Overwatch. Okay, so to give a quick background, player toxicity is something that for people who play with games regularly are very familiar with, but for people who are outside the industry or don't play games that often, the definition can be kind of unclear. And this is because game players, game publishers, game developers, and game journalists all sort of had a different perspective and terminology for what player toxicity can be. But from drawing from all the sources that they provide, we can get to the nebulous definition that player toxicity is the intentional impediment and harassment of other players, typically using exploitation of the game's systems or racially and sexually charged language. So player toxicity is something that sort of first came to light for the discussion of player communities in the inception of social multiplayer games back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And we see this in game genres such as MUDs or MUDs or multi-user dungeons, which were essentially the first multiplayer games. And we also see them in massive multiplayer online games such as the very familiar World of Warcraft or Ultima Online and EverQuest. As technology would develop in both fidelity and in scale, we would see player toxicity become a subject of discussion in genres stemming out from just the multiplayer RPG. Genres such as the first-person shooters, games such as Call of Duty, Halo, Counter-Strike, in genres such as the MOBA genre with League of Legends and Dota 2, as well as the current day genre of the Battle Royale with Fortnite and Apex Legends. Later on, game businesses would begin to take a really strong look at toxicity in the games industry because they begin to realize they had a very real stake in the health of their communities within the game. The health of their community can ultimately dictate how much a player will invest in a game, both their time and their money. And furthermore, if a game community becomes reputable for having a very toxic community, it can be something that really hinders both the development of the franchise and also not the bottom line for the company, and of course, it also smears their timeline as well. So, to get to the subject of this discussion, Overwatch. So Overwatch was a game developed at Blizzard Entertainment, released in May of 2016. It is classified as a first-person shooter, competitive, team-based multiplayer game. To kind of break down how this works visually, mechanically, essentially, a group of 12 people are organized in 2 groups of 6, and they compete for objectives on randomly assigned arenas. They'll each have their own aesthetic flourishes and level design, and there's essentially a sense of progression as these players play more games. They unlock new cosmetic rewards for characters that they can play as within these matches. Every character that they can select has a certain weakness and strength, as well as unique visual style and cultural background as well. So when this game released, it received a massive critical acclaim, both for its mechanical polish and the compellingness of its team play, but also for the ethos of inclusivity and hope that it predicated itself on. In Overwatch, we see a focus on cultures and characters from diverse backgrounds that we don't necessarily see in mainstream media and in mainstream games. Characters, for example, some of the characters that are in the game descend from countries such as Mexico, Haiti, China, Korea, and Nigeria. So when the game's so great, what could possibly be a problem? So Overwatch, as time began to go on, started to become synonymous with a very stressful and toxic player community. And one of the reasons for this is that Overwatch at its core is a highly competitive game, which isn't necessarily something that is negative, but a lot of the games in Overwatch have very high stakes. And when players aren't performing to the degree that their peers perceive that they should be performing at, or if they pick a character that has a tool set that isn't conducive to the team's composition, there can be a lot of friction between players that charges negative social biases that are then released in the game. Especially given that the game has built-in social communication channels such as text and voice chat. So ultimately, this is compounded by the fact that the Overwatch as a game sort of focuses a lot of its developmental time and energy on adding new bells and whistles as well as new tiers to these competitive game modes, it doesn't necessarily offer a lot of enticing rewards for casual play. Furthermore, it can be difficult because Overwatch is such a team-based game. If you want to get good or really understand how a character works, it can be difficult to place yourself in a competitive setting, where arguably the most mechanically intense competition happens, because if you're perceived as playing a character that you shouldn't be playing, you can get put in a position where you're playing as a character you don't know that well, and it can be very uncomfortable, and toxicity can arise from that. So to address the issue of toxicity in Overwatch, it's necessary to take a look at some of the perspectives that come from the discussion of player toxicity. So 3 main perspectives that I found in my research. The first one is something that's repeatedly cited by both game journalists and game players through social forums. Also, these quotes are sourced anonymously with consent from different social forums. Anyway, so the first perspective is that anonymity is a chief contributor to player toxicity, and there is certain merit to that fact. There's merit perceived by the players in the sense that, like, if somebody doesn't have enough encouragement to not behave a certain way, then they're just simply going to continue their toxic or negative behavior in the game. A second channel that is often seen from the developmental side of things, from people outside of the team developing Overwatch, is that Overwatch, because it at its core is a competitive game, ultimately rewards really aggressive and aggressive behaviors in comparison with players who aren't as interested in such an intense and serious experience. And while there is talk about making the game more lax and easier in the competitive settings, easier in the sense that there's more fail-safes against losing, a lot of people also argue against it because they don't want that value from the rewards you get, that ranked experience, to be diminished. The third perspective is something that's espoused by the Fair Play Alliance, which is a coalition of several different big gaming companies against toxicity. Their aim is to essentially assist each other both in the discussion and infrastructure of development against toxicity. Their stance is that player toxicity is ultimately a clashing of player perspectives. And to put that into practice, a single game of Overwatch can have a player who's looking for a very casual and fun experience, paired with a player who's looking for a very intense and serious experience. And because it can ultimately clash to the gameplay, we have the manifestation of toxic moments and toxic behavior. So, Blizzard Entertainment took this to heart and developed a solution against it. So the endorsement system is essentially the Blizzard Entertainment's critical darling against player toxicity. It's a system that's essentially a player-run rewards program. As you play a game, at the end of every match, you are allowed to give awards to certain players, up to 4 for both your team and the opposing team. And as you receive more of these rewards, your endorsement rank, which is a new icon above your player profile, will begin to grow and begin to go up in numerical value. As you continually play Overwatch, you'll be paired with people who are of the similar rank. And in this way, the system is aimed to separate players who are very well-behaved and play in a way that isn't conducive to the game with other players who play similarly. And conversely, players who are very communicative and very sportsmanlike with other players who are also very sportsmanlike. Furthermore, there is a decay built into the system so that players who play very, very, very regularly get to a high rank and are paired with other people who play very seriously and very regularly as well. The longer you go without in-game of Overwatch, the more your rank will begin to decline. And in that way, there's kind of like a gradient for people who play to mess around, for people to play very seriously, and then there's a casual audience in between. However, the system is not entirely perfect. When it was released, it had like a lot of game journalists praised it for the way that they personally experienced a much nicer community when playing the game. Months later, Blizzard Entertainment would they themselves release a statistic that player-reported toxicity went down by 40%, which is very impressive given the fact that Overwatch has millions and millions of players. And a lot of players would, over time, begin to criticize the endorsement system because of the way that it doesn't provide enough incentives for continually receiving those endorsements. The rewards you get from your endorsement rank aren't necessarily things you can't get out of just playing the game normally. Furthermore, there's a lot of discussion about player banning and tribunals because a lot of players perceive that there's not enough done to punish people who continue to play toxically and completely ignore the endorsement system. However, Blizzard Entertainment's efforts did not go unnoticed. They ultimately influenced a lot of other very, very big game developers who also have their own competitive games. Such titles include League of Legends, developed by Riot Games, who after the release of the enforcement system released their own version, which is practically the same thing, except they included the fact that there is now exclusive rewards behind the honor system, and so there's things that are very flashy and very players perceive to be compelling rewards hidden behind the honor system that you have to participate in to be able to acquire. Furthermore, we have very public statements said by game companies such as Ubisoft Entertainment in France, who developed Rainbow Six Siege and For Honor, that they themselves want to develop a similar system and will also take a zero-tolerance stance against toxicity in their own games. So altogether, this is important because Overwatch's enforcement system essentially furthers the discussion of addressing player toxicity in the games industry. It puts forth more developed technology to address the issues we begin to find as games continually grow into a billion-dollar industry with billions of players all over the world. And ultimately, this helps us enjoy the games that we love because without having our immersion or enjoyment broken by harassment, a racial slur, or just general player toxicity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Oliver.
Yeah.
We now have a couple of minutes. I'm Emma, by the way, I'm a German professor, moderator, and most importantly, Oliver's German teacher. We have a couple of minutes if there are any questions for Oliver, and then I'm going to turn things over to Oliver's advisor, Professor Johnson, to give Oliver his honors, stolen recognition of his work. Yeah.
So what do you think should be some future considerations in regards to toxicity?
So I think Blizzard Entertainment took a really pretty smart approach because they really implement a lot of behavioral psychology in their approach. And so I think that in the future, when game companies are looking to further develop or create a competitive game, I think they're probably going to try to take a more hard stance towards providing things that are you have to be an effective team player to be able to acquire. And one of the things that we see is Apex Legends, one of the games that was just released recently, and was a lot of critical acclaim, is also a very competitive game. Had a highly developed ping system, which is essentially where you can mark on the map visually where things are, and you can click on that ping on your home screen, even if you're not the person who did it initially. It'd be like, yes, I understand. And so in this way, players have limited communication capabilities, such as they don't have a mic because the game doesn't have text chat itself, are able to communicate effectively, and by communicating effectively, you increase your chance to winning the game drastically. So I think that's there's a lot of really cool small things you can do to reward communication, but I think that further blending that into the game experience itself is ultimately what a lot of game developers are trying to do. It was fun. Yes.
Ali, what are your experiences with that toxicity? I assume this is a game that you love.
Yeah, I play a lot of it. Yeah, no, it's so I think one of the biggest issues that I've had personally with playing Overwatch is limited perspectives. Because as a game, when you're playing the game yourself, it's a first-person perspective, and you don't necessarily get to see what all the other players are doing. So oftentimes, when a really bad thing happens for your team, you only experience the bad thing that happened, and not the miscommunication that led up to it, or the just simple stroke of luck the enemy team had that led up to that experience. For example, there'll be times when I'm put into a position where I have to support my teammates, but I accidentally an enemy player appears behind me and then is able to eliminate my character, and then after the match ends, it's why weren't you there for me? What was going on? And it's and you try to tell them what happened, and they're just no, I don't believe you. It's something that's compounded a lot by the limited range of understanding that we often get in high intensity games.
I noticed that you mentioned anonymity as a contributor to potential toxicity, but that it's not necessarily a big part of proposed solutions. Is that because it's just sort of non-negotiable in this world that there wouldn't be buy-in if you did have to link it to, or that's just hard to do, or is that something that anyone is talking about, or that's not on the table?
Well, it's a sensitive discussion because player privacy is a big thing for a lot of companies, and I know a lot of players unofficially informed, yeah, it'd be great if there was actual stakes if your actual name is used, and players whoa, no. Because like there's also like we see incidents every once in a while of like people like looking up people's addresses mid-game, being fueled by that toxic like those negative emotions to be like they go like do something like call like the SWAT in your local area to your team or something, and it's like people can do pretty like intense stuff to other people that we've seen. So I think there's like they want to kind of like convey that stake, but not maintain their privacy as well.
Is there, so this might be a really naive question. Is it just how you're talking about some games, you're given badges or whatever?
Yeah.
Like incentives, but the incentives you earn in the game anyway, so they're not necessarily special. So now what you said, like, so the rate of like calling somebody out went down, right?
So
Well,
yeah.
I guess I'm curious, what's the monetary, like, if there's an anonymity to the game because of their privacy,
Yeah.
what's that other incentive? Because sometimes the way that we choose to control people often is by cost,
Mhm.
or
Of course.
like pay scales or something.
Yeah, there is something for that too. So Overwatch is like the way that you progress in the game is that every time you have these like experience checkpoints, which essentially measures how much time you played, and then rewards you with like this with like a cosmetic loot box. So like you open it, you get 5 random cosmetics. That can be earned with real money as well. But if you participate in the endorsement system, you get a lot of them if you get like the highest rank. And so in that, it kind of like encourages people to play because you get a lot of these free boxes as well. And furthermore, like there was like the more people that you endorse, every endorsement kind of gives a very small percentage of your experience bar too. So like it kind of speeds up your acquisition of getting those cosmetics. And of course, like in the game itself, you want to be like there's in the high level play, you want to be paired with people who are also really communicable, because that way you can get to like the highest ranks of the competitive mode, and then earn the special rewards at the end of that competitive mode too. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Oliver, it's really fascinating and. I just want to clap again in just a moment, but more clapping.
That's right. I'm sick, so I won't use this. But, yeah, so just want to say a couple things about Oliver. Number one is this is truly something he's an expert in. Every time I talk to him, not only does he know about pretty much every video game and has played every obscure video game and knows about every game that's coming out that somebody has been following forever. He's one of the 3 people following it. But he's also plugged into all the communities, so he knows what's going on in the news and what's going on in each of these game communities, and I have no idea how he does it. But yeah. So anyway, this is something that he's clearly an expert on, and so yeah, I'm proud to have been supporting him on this. Thank you, Professor. All right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there was no time scheduled in for me.
Shouldn't we acknowledge, Emma, you had some other news that you might,
Oh,
Emma's also the incoming